The barrel of a silenced pistol was the first thing Lorenzo expected to see when he walked into his own home. He was the Don of the Moretti crime family, and death was an old friend. But that night, as he stepped into his foyer, bleeding and exhausted, he didn't find a gunman. He found Emma. She was just the maid, the quiet woman who ironed his suits and polished the silver. But tonight, she wasn't holding a duster. She was standing in the shadows of the hallway, eyes wide with terror, pressing a single finger against her ruby-red lips. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked the most dangerous man in the city, dead in the eye, and whispered 2 words that would shatter his reality. Stay silent. What happened next wasn't just a betrayal. It was a massacre waiting to happen. And the person holding the knife? You will never guess who it is. The rain over Chicago wasn't washing away the sins of the city. It was just making the streets slicker, more dangerous. Lorenzo Moretti sat in the back of his armored Mercedes, his hand pressed firmly against his side. The dark fabric of his bespoke Italian suit was wet, but not with rain. It was thick, warm blood. "Boss, we need to get you to the dock," his driver, a kid named Sal, said, his eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. Sal's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "No," Lorenzo grunted, the pain radiating up his ribs with every bump in the road. "Take me home. The mansion. Now." "But the deal, boss," Sterling said. "Sterling is dead," Lorenzo cut him off, his voice low and jagged like broken glass. "And if you don't drive faster, you will be too." The deal at the docks had been a setup, a classic ambush. The Sterling family had promised a truce, a merging of territories along the north side. Instead, they had brought automatic rifles. Lorenzo had put 2 bullets in Arthur Sterling's chest before he even realized his own men were falling around him. He had barely made it out. The car screeched to a halt in front of the iron gates of the Moretti estate. It was a fortress of stone and ivy, a place that was supposed to be impenetrable. Lorenzo dismissed Sal at the gate. He didn't want anyone seeing him this week. He needed whiskey, a needle and thread, and silence. He punched the code into the side entrance, a private door that led directly into the library wing. The lock clicked, a heavy, mechanical sound that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, it sounded like a cell door slamming shut. He stepped inside. The house was dark. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The staff should have been in the servants' quarters in the east wing. The house should have been empty. Lorenzo limped down the hallway, trailing droplets of rain and blood on the marble floor. He reached for his holster, unclipped his Glock 19, and held it loose by his side. Paranoia was the only thing that kept a man like him alive past 40. He turned the corner toward his study and froze. The door to his private office was ajar. A sliver of golden light spilled out onto the floor. Rage, hot and immediate, flooded his system, momentarily numbing the pain in his side. No one entered his office. Not his captains, not his girlfriends, and certainly not the help. It was the nerve center of his empire. He raised the gun, his movement silent despite his injury. He pushed the door open with the toe of his boot, ready to fire. But he didn't fire. Standing behind his massive mahogany desk wasn't an assassin. It was Emma. She was the newest maid, hired only 3 months ago. She was young, perhaps 24, with dark hair usually pulled back in a severe bun. Now, strands of it had fallen loose around her face. She was wearing her uniform, but it looked disheveled. Lorenzo opened his mouth to roar at her, to demand why she was snooping in his private sanctuary, to threaten her life for crossing the line. But before he could make a sound, Emma moved with a speed that startled him. She didn't cower. She didn't drop the papers she was holding. She lunged forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed a finger urgently to her lips. "Stay silent," she hissed. Her voice wasn't the meek, polite tone she used when serving him coffee. It was commanding. Sharp. Lorenzo frowned, the gun still pointed at her chest. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't—" She grabbed his lapel, actually grabbed the Don of the Moretti family, and yanked him sideways, pulling him into the alcove behind a heavy velvet drape, just as the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Lorenzo stiffened. He heard it then, the heavy, deliberate thud of boots on the marble. Not Sal's nervous shuffle. Not the rhythmic patrol of his outside guards. Someone was in the house. Someone who walked with the arrogance of ownership. Emma's hand was still on his chest, right over his heart. Her eyes were locked on his, wide and terrified, but focused. She mouthed the words again, soundlessly this time. "Don't. Move." The air in the alcove was thick with the scent of old books and Emma's perfume, something like vanilla and lavender. But beneath that, Lorenzo could smell the metallic tang of his own blood and the sharp spike of adrenaline coming off the woman pressed against him. "Clear the room," a voice growled from the office. Lorenzo's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was deep, gravelly, and unmistakably familiar. It was Marco. Marco Vane, his sottocapo, his underboss, the man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral, the man who had sworn a blood oath to protect the Moretti family with his dying breath. "It's empty," another voice replied, younger, nervous, one of the new recruits, a kid named Leo. "Good," Marco said. The sound of a heavy bag being dropped onto the desk echoed through the room. "Find the ledger, the red one. It has the account numbers for the offshore holdings in the Caymans. If we don't have that, the Cipriani family won't pay us the full 10 million. Lorenzo felt a growl building in his throat, a primal noise of pure fury. Marco wasn't just stealing. He was selling the entire organization out to the Ciprianis, their bitterest rivals. The ambush at the docks tonight hadn't been a sterling setup. It had been Marco clearing the board. Lorenzo made to step out, to put a bullet in the back of Marco's skull. Injury be damned. Emma's grip on his arm tightened. She dug her fingernails into his bicep, hard enough to bruise. She shook her head violently. Why is she stopping me? Lorenzo thought. I can take them. Then he heard the unmistakable sound of a slide racking back on a submachine gun. Check the perimeter, Marco ordered. I want this place rigged to blow in 10 minutes. If Lorenzo survived the ambush, he'll be coming back here to lick his wounds. I want him to walk into a crater. A bomb. Lorenzo looked down at Emma. She wasn't just a maid who had stumbled onto a burglary. She knew exactly what was happening. She had been in the office before Marco arrived. Who are you? He asked her with his eyes. She didn't answer. She just slowly reached down to her ankle. Under the hem of her maid's skirt, strapped to her calf, was a holster. She drew a compact Sig Sauer P365. Lorenzo stared. His maid was packing heat, and she held it with a grip that spoke of training, not street violence. They have thermal, Emma whispered, her mouth barely an inch from his ear. If we stay here, they'll see our heat signatures through the curtain in about 30 seconds. How do you know that? Lorenzo whispered back, the pain in his side throbbing in time with his heartbeat. Because I know Marco, she said grimly, and I know the equipment he bought from the Russians last month. Follow me. Now. She didn't wait for his permission. She turned and slipped through a small service panel in the wall behind the curtain, a servant's passage that Lorenzo knew existed but hadn't used since he was a child playing hide-and-seek. He followed her into the narrow, dusty corridor, the darkness swallowing them whole. As the panel clicked shut behind them, he heard Marco's voice again, muffled but clear. "I smell his cologne. He's been here. Find him!" The hunt was on, and for the first time in 20 years, Lorenzo Moretti wasn't the predator. He was the prey. The servants' passage was narrow, smelling of dry rot and dust. It was pitch black, but Emma moved with an eerie confidence, her hand trailing along the left wall to guide them. Lorenzo followed, his breathing labored. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and the reality of the bullet wound was setting in. He was losing blood fast. "Stop!" Lorenzo grunted, leaning heavily against a wooden beam. "I need a minute." Emma spun around. In the sliver of light coming from a crack in the floorboards above, he saw her face. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She holstered her weapon and moved to his side, her hands inspecting his wound with professional efficiency. "Exit wound?" she asked, her voice hushed. "No. Still in there," Lorenzo gritted out. "It missed the artery, but you're bleeding out," she said, tearing a strip of fabric from her apron. She pressed it hard against his side. Lorenzo hissed in pain. "Keep pressure on this. We have to keep moving. If we stop, we die." "Who are you, Emma?" Lorenzo demanded, grabbing her wrist. "Maids don't carry Sig Sauers. Maids don't know about thermal optics. Are you a cop? A Fed?" If she was a Fed, he'd have to kill her. Even if she was saving him now, he couldn't let an agent this deep into his life survive. Emma looked at him, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "I'm not a cop, Lorenzo, and I'm not a maid. My name isn't even Emma." "Then who are you?" "My name is Sarah," she said quietly. "Sarah Miller." The name hit Lorenzo like a physical blow. He staggered back, nearly hitting the wall. "Miller! Arthur Miller's daughter." Arthur Miller had been Lorenzo's accountant 10 years ago. A good man, a family man. He had been caught skimming money, not for greed, but to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. The rules of the mafia were absolute. Stealing was death. Lorenzo had ordered the hit himself. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had signed the death warrant. "You're here to kill me," Lorenzo said, his hand drifting back to his gun. "Revenge. That's what this is." "Emma." Sarah laughed, a bitter, dry sound. "If I wanted you dead, Lorenzo, I would have poisoned your coffee 3 months ago. I've had 1,000 chances. I've made your bed, cooked your food, watched you sleep." "Then why?" Lorenzo asked, confused. "Why save the man who killed your father?" "Because Marco didn't just kill my father," she spat, the anger finally breaking through her calm facade. "He tortured him. He made it slow. You ordered a clean death, Lorenzo. A bullet to the head. Marco enjoyed it. And then he came for my mother. He burned our house down with her inside." Lorenzo stayed silent. He hadn't known that. Marco had reported it as a clean job. "I'm not here for you," she continued. "I'm here for Marco. I've been tracking him for 5 years. I infiltrated your house to get close to him, to find the proof that he's been stealing from you, to make him suffer. Saving you." She hesitated. "Saving you is just a necessary evil. I need you alive to destroy him." Above them, heavy footsteps thundered on the floorboards. Dust rained down on their heads. "They're in the master bedroom," Sarah whispered. "We have to go down. The basement. There's a tunnel that leads to the old carriage house, right?" Lorenzo nodded, impressed despite himself. "Yeah. How do you know about that?" "I studied the blueprints of this house for 6 months before I applied for the job," she said. "Come on." They moved deeper into the walls, descending a narrow, rickety staircase. Lorenzo's vision was starting to blur. He stumbled, his knee buckling. Sarah caught him. She was smaller than him, half his weight, but she braced her shoulder under his arm and hauled him up. "Don't you dare die on me, Moretti," she whispered fiercely. "You owe me a life. You don't get to check out until the debt is paid." They reached the basement level. Sarah kicked open a grate, and they spilled out into the main cellar, surrounded by racks of vintage wine, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. "The tunnel is behind the reserve rack," Lorenzo wheezed, pointing to the far wall. But before they could move, the heavy oak door at the top of the cellar stairs burst open. A beam of tactical light cut through the darkness, blinding them. "Found them!" a voice shouted. Gunfire erupted instantly. Bullets shattered the wine bottles around them, spraying glass and expensive red wine like shrapnel and blood. Sarah shoved Lorenzo behind a large oak barrel and returned fire, her shots controlled and precise. Pop, 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 pop. A body tumbled down the stairs. "We're pinned!" she yelled over the noise. "Can you run?" "I can try." Lorenzo grit his teeth. "On my count. Suppressing fire." Sarah leaned out and unleashed a rapid volley of shots toward the doorway, forcing the attackers to duck. "Go! Move!" Lorenzo lunged for the wine rack. He grabbed the hidden lever behind a bottle of 1945 Romani Conti and pulled. The heavy wooden shelf groaned and swung open, revealing the damp, dark mouth of the escape tunnel. "Get in!" he shouted. Sarah fired 2 last shots and scrambled after him. Lorenzo slammed the shelf shut from the inside and threw the locking bolt just as a hail of bullets chewed up the wood where they had been standing seconds ago. They were in the tunnel. It was silent, cold, and smelled of wet earth. "They'll blow the door," Lorenzo said, sliding down the wall to sit on the dirt floor. He couldn't go any further. The darkness was closing in on the edges of his vision. "Let them," Sarah said, kneeling beside him. She checked her magazine. "I have 3 rounds left. You?" Lorenzo checked his Glock. "Empty." "Great," she muttered. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face in the dim light of the tunnel. "We need to get to a safe house. Do you have one that Marco doesn't know about?" Lorenzo laughed weakly. "Marco knows everything. He's my right hand. Think, Lorenzo. There has to be somewhere. A place you kept for yourself. A place not on the books." Lorenzo's mind drifted. There was one place. A small cabin by the lake, bought under a shell company, 3 layers deep. He had bought it for a woman he loved years ago. A woman who had died before they could ever go there. He had never told a soul about it. Not even Marco. "The lake house," Lorenzo mumbled. "North, up near Highland Park." "Good," Sarah said. "We're going there." "I can't walk," Lorenzo whispered. The loss of blood was too much. Sarah grabbed his face in her hands, slapping his cheek lightly. "Listen to me. Marco rigged the house. He set a timer. I saw it on his watch. We have maybe 4 minutes before this entire estate goes up in flames. If we are in this tunnel when that happens, the shock wave will collapse it and bury us alive. You have to walk. You have to." Lorenzo looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. The hatred for Marco, yes, but also a stubborn refusal to let death win. It was the same look he used to have, before the money and the power made him soft. He gritted his teeth, summoned every ounce of will he had left, and nodded. "Okay, help me up." They began the long, agonizing limp through the dark, racing against a clock they couldn't see, with an explosion waiting at their backs and a city of traitors waiting ahead. The tunnel exit opened into the dense woods behind the estate, hidden beneath a camouflage of ivy and rotting logs. Lorenzo and Sarah spilled out onto the wet earth, gasping for air, just as the ground beneath them shuddered. Boom! The sound wasn't just a noise, it was a physical force. The shockwave ripped through the trees, shaking the rain from the leaves like a sudden storm. a massive fireball erupted into the night sky behind them, turning the clouds a bruised purple and orange. The Moretti estate, Lorenzo's legacy, his father's home, was gone. Lorenzo didn't look back. He couldn't. The pain in his side was a white-hot poker, blinding him to everything else. "Car," he wheezed. "Service Road, half-mile east." They moved like ghosts through the forest. Sarah supported almost all of his weight now. Every step was a battle. By the time they reached the old service road where the landscaping crews parked their trucks, Lorenzo was drifting in and out of consciousness. There was an old Ford pickup truck parked there. Sarah didn't ask for keys. She smashed the driver's side window with the butt of her gun, unlocked the door, and hot-wired the ignition with a terrifying efficiency that made Lorenzo smirk through his pain. "Where did you learn to do that?" he mumbled as she shoved him into the passenger seat. "YouTube," she said, slamming the truck into gear. The drive north was a blur of headlights and rain. Lorenzo passed out twice. When he finally woke fully, the truck had stopped. They were at the cabin. It was a rustic A-frame hidden deep in the woods near the Wisconsin border, a place frozen in time. Inside, Sarah dumped him onto the leather sofa. The air was cold and stale. She scrambled to light a fire in the stone hearth, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "I need supplies," she said, standing over him. "There's a first aid kit under the sink in the bathroom. I saw it when I checked the perimeter." "Whiskey," Lorenzo gritted out. "Top shelf. Kitchen." She returned with a bottle of rye, a needle, fishing line, and a pair of pliers she had sterilized in the fire. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. "Do it," Lorenzo commanded. He took a long pull from the bottle, the burn of the alcohol distracting him momentarily from the hole in his side. The next 20 minutes were a blur of agony. Sarah dug for the bullet. She wasn't a doctor, but she had steady hands. When the metal clinked into the ceramic bowl, Lorenzo let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for hours. She poured whiskey into the wound. He screamed then, a raw animal sound, and stitched him up with the fishing line. When it was done, he lay sweating and shivering by the fire. Sarah sat on the floor beside him, her hands covered in his blood. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her dark hair matted with rain and dirt. "You saved me," Lorenzo whispered, his voice raspy. "I told you," she said, staring into the fire. "I need you to kill Marco." "Is that the only reason?" Sarah turned to look at him. The firelight softened the hard lines of her face. For a moment, she wasn't the avenging daughter or the tactical genius. She was just a woman sitting next to a man she had pulled back from the brink of death. "My father," she began, her voice quiet. "He used to talk about you, before the end. He said you were tough, but fair. He respected you, Lorenzo. That's why his betrayal, why the theft hurt him so much. He didn't steal for greed. He stole because the medical bills were drowning us." "I know," Lorenzo said. "I found out later, after the order was signed. You could have stopped it. I didn't know until it was too late. But the signature, I signed it." He looked at the ceiling. "I have to live with that." Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she reached out and took the bottle of whiskey from his hand. She took a swig, wincing at the burn. Marco was the one who found the discrepancy in the books. Marco was the one who brought the evidence to you. Marco was the one who volunteered to carry out the hit. Lorenzo's eyes widened. "Marco brought me the file. He said he double-checked everything." "He framed him," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "I found the original ledgers in your office tonight. That's what I was looking for. Marco had been skimming from the accounts for years. When my father got close to finding out, Marco set him up to take the fall. My father didn't steal a dime, Lorenzo. Marco stole it all, pinned it on my dad, and then used you to execute the only witness. The revelation hit Lorenzo harder than the bullet. He tried to sit up, but the pain forced him back down. Marco hadn't just betrayed him tonight. He had been playing him for a decade. He had turned Lorenzo into a monster who killed an innocent man. "I'm going to kill him," Lorenzo vowed, his voice low and terrifying. "I'm going to take him apart, see, piece by piece." "We," Sarah corrected him. She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his. The distance between them vanished. In the heat of the fire, amidst the smell of blood and whiskey, the tension shifted. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a pact, a blood bond. "We," Lorenzo agreed. She reached out and wiped a smear of blood from his cheek. Her touch was gentle. Lorenzo leaned into it, closing his eyes. He was a king without a kingdom, wounded and hunted. But lying there in the dark with the daughter of the man he killed, he felt more dangerous than he ever had in his life. 2 weeks passed. The cabin became their world. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing the woods in silence. Inside, plans were being forged. Lorenzo healed with a speed that surprised even Sarah. He was driven by a singular purpose: vengeance. While he did push-ups on the rug to regain his strength, Sarah turned the dining table into a war room. She had managed to salvage a laptop from the truck, an old thing she found under the seat, and hacked into the local Wi-Fi of a neighbor 2 miles away. "Look at this," she said one morning, turning the screen toward him. It was a news stream. A picture of Marco Vane flashed on the screen. He was wearing one of Lorenzo's suits. The headline read, "New leadership in local import-export business promises stability." "He's legitimizing," Lorenzo scoffed, buttoning his shirt. "He's trying to go corporate. That's why he wanted the offshore accounts. He wants to wash the blood off his money." "He's throwing a gala," Sarah said, tapping a key. "New Year's Eve, the Grand Hotel downtown. It's his coming out party as the new Don. All the families will be there. The Sterlings, the Ciprianis, the Russians. He's going to announce the merger of the territories." "New Year's Eve," Lorenzo mused. "That's 3 days from now." "It's a masquerade ball," Sarah added, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "Black tie and masks." "Perfect," Lorenzo said. He walked over to the loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin, the one place he had checked immediately upon arrival. He pried it open. Inside was a metal box containing 2 clean passports, $50,000 in cash, and a pair of Beretta 92FS pistols. He tossed a bundle of cash onto the table. "We need clothes, we need weapons, and we need an entry strategy." "I can hack the guest list," Sarah said. "I'll add us as Mr. and Mrs. Rossi from the Nevada Syndicate. No one knows them well enough to question it." "And the weapons?" "The security will be tight. Metal detectors. Pat-downs." Lorenzo smiled. It was the smile of the wolf who had finally healed. "Marco is arrogant. He thinks I'm dead. He thinks you're just a maid who died in the blast. He won't be looking for threats inside the room. He'll be looking for them outside." He picked up one of the Berettas and checked the slide. "We don't bring guns in. We take them from the guards once we're inside." Sarah stood up. She had changed in the last 2 weeks. She wasn't the maid anymore. She wore jeans and one of Lorenzo's flannel shirts, her hair loose. She looked like a soldier. "One thing," she said. "When we get to Marco, he's mine. I want to look him in the eye when he realizes he lost." "He's yours," Lorenzo promised. He stepped closer to her. The intimacy of the last 2 weeks hung heavy in the air. They had slept in the same bed for warmth, shared meals, shared secrets. They hadn't crossed the line physically, the mission came first. but the magnetic pull was undeniable. "After this," Lorenzo said softly, "if we survive." "What happens to us?" Sarah looked up at him. "Let's survive first." The Grand Hotel ballroom was a sea of silk, velvet, and diamonds. A live orchestra played Mozart, while waiters navigated the crowd with trays of champagne. The air smelled of expensive perfume and hypocrisy. Every major criminal in the city was here, pretending to be a civilized businessman. At the top of the grand staircase, the announcer cleared his throat. Mr. and Mrs. Rossi. Lorenzo and Sarah stepped into the light. They were breathtaking. Lorenzo wore a midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a black velvet mask covering the upper half of his face. But it was Sarah who stopped the room. She wore a floor-length gown of crimson silk, the color of fresh blood, that clung to every curve. Her mask was gold, filigreed and delicate. She didn't look like a maid. She looked like a queen. They descended the stairs, arms linked, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Stay close," Lorenzo murmured, his eyes scanning the room. "I see 4 guards by the east exit, 2 by the stage. Marco is on the balcony." Marco was indeed there. He stood above the crowd, holding a glass of scotch, looking down at his kingdom like a god. He wasn't wearing a mask. He wanted everyone to see his face. "He looks happy," Sarah whispered, her grip on Lorenzo's arm tightening. "He won't be for long." They moved through the crowd, dancing the social dance. Lorenzo charmed the wife of the Russian mob boss. Sarah flirted with the underboss of the Cipriani family, subtly lifting his security keycard from his pocket while he laughed at her joke. "I have the key to the service elevators," she whispered to Lorenzo as they met near the bar. "Good. The armory stash for the security detail is on the mezzanine level. We need to move." Suddenly, the music stopped. A spotlight hit the balcony. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marco's voice boomed over the speakers. "Thank you for joining me on this historic night. Tonight we leave the past behind. The old ways died with the old leadership. Tonight we embrace the future." The crowd applauded. Marco raised his glass. "To the Moretti Empire, or should I say, the Vane Empire." While the room cheered, Lorenzo and Sarah slipped into the shadows of the side corridor. They moved fast. Sarah swiped the keycard, and they entered the service stairwell. On the mezzanine landing, a lone guard was smoking a cigarette. Before he could turn, Lorenzo was on him. He didn't kill him. He just choked him out with a sleeper hold, lowering him silently to the floor. He took the guard's radio and his sidearm. "1 gun," Lorenzo said, handing it to Sarah. "You take it." "What about you?" Lorenzo flexed his hands. "I'll improvise." They reached the door to the private balcony box where Marco was standing. 2 guards stood outside. Sarah stepped out first, feigning drunkenness. "Oh, excuse me, boys. Is this the ladies' room?" The guards hesitated, distracted by the woman in the red dress. That split second was all Lorenzo needed. He emerged from the stairwell like a battering ram. He took the first guard down with a knee to the solar plexus and a chop to the throat. As the second guard reached for his weapon, Sarah raised the stolen pistol and pistol-whipped him across the temple. He dropped like a stone. Lorenzo looked at her, impressed. "Nice swing." "I played softball in high school," she shrugged. Lorenzo kicked the heavy double doors open. Marco turned, annoyance flashing across his face. "I said no interruptions." The words died in his throat. Lorenzo Moretti stood in the doorway, ripping the black mask from his face. The scars from the explosion had healed, but they left him looking rugged, dangerous, and very, very alive. "Hello, Marco," Lorenzo said. The music from the ballroom below drifted up, a cheerful waltz that clashed with the murderous tension in the room. Marco dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor. Lorenzo, that's impossible. The house, the thermal scans. You missed a spot, Lorenzo said, stepping into the room. Marco reached for the gun under his jacket, but Sarah was faster. She stepped out from behind Lorenzo, leveling her weapon at Marco's chest. She pulled off her gold mask. Marco squinted at her. The maid? You're alive too. I'm not the maid, Marco, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. I'm Sarah Miller. Marco's face went white. He knew that name. Miller? Arthur's kid? The man you framed, Sarah said, stepping closer, the gun unwavering. The man you tortured. Marco laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. So that's what this is? A family reunion. Lorenzo, listen to me. We can work this out. I have the money. Millions. We can split it. You sold my family to the Ciprianis, Lorenzo said, his voice devoid of emotion. You tried to kill me in my own home. I did what I had to do, Marco yelled, backing up against the balcony railing. You were soft, Lorenzo. You were letting the business stagnate. I made us strong again. You made us rats, Lorenzo spat. Marco's eyes darted around the room. He saw no escape. Suddenly he lunged for Sarah, thinking she was the weak link. Big mistake. Sarah didn't flinch. She fired. Bang! The bullet took Marco in the kneecap. He screamed and collapsed to the floor. That was for my father, she said coldly. She walked over to him, standing over his writhing form. She aimed the gun at his other knee. Bang! That was for my mother. Marco was sobbing now, crawling backward, dragging his useless legs. Lorenzo, call her off. Please. Lorenzo leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. She's not my employee, Marco. She's my partner. I don't control her. Sarah aimed the gun at Marco's head. This was the moment she had dreamed of for 5 years. The execution. But she didn't pull the trigger. She paused. She looked at Lorenzo. If I kill him, she said softly, it's over quickly. He deserves to suffer. He deserves to rot in a cell. Lorenzo nodded slowly. If we kill him, we're just murderers. If we expose him, we destroy everything he built. Sarah smiled. She lowered the gun. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small USB drive. She walked over to the AV console that controlled the giant screen in the ballroom below. What are you doing? Marco wheezed. Giving a speech, Sarah said. She jammed the drive in. Below in the ballroom, the music stopped abruptly. The giant screen behind the stage flickered. Suddenly, an audio recording began to play. It was Marco's voice, recorded by the bug Sarah had planted in the office months ago. Yeah, I framed Miller. Stupid accountant never knew what hit him. And once Lorenzo is out of the way, I'll sell the whole operation to the feds in exchange for immunity. I'll give them the Sterlings, the Ciprianis, everyone. The ballroom went deathly silent. Every mob boss, every captain, every criminal in the room heard Marco Vane admitting he was going to rat them all out to the FBI. Marco's face turned the color of ash. No, he whispered. No, no, no. Lorenzo walked over to the balcony railing and looked down. He saw the upturned faces of the crowd. He saw the Sterling family reaching for their weapons. He saw the Ciprianis moving toward the stairs. They're coming for you, Marco, Lorenzo said calmly. And I don't think they're going to be as polite as Sarah was. Lorenzo offered his arm to Sarah. Shall we? She took it. They walked out of the private box, stepping over Marco's sobbing form, leaving him to the wolves he had tried to lead. The heavy oak doors of the private balcony swung shut behind them, muffling the pathetic sobbing of Marco Vane, but the chaos they had unleashed was already beginning to bleed through the walls. Lorenzo and Sarah walked down the service corridor, their footsteps sinking in a rhythm of grim determination. They didn't run. Running was an admission of guilt, a sign of fear. Lorenzo Moretti did not run. Even now, stripped of his title, his home, and his army, he moved with the predatory grace of a lion walking through tall grass. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. Lorenzo tilted his head. Below them, the grand ballroom had erupted. The elegant strains of Mozart had been replaced by a low, rising roar, the sound of 300 dangerous people realizing they had been betrayed. It was the sound of a riot starting. "The recording is looping," Lorenzo said, a dark satisfaction curling the corner of his lip. "Every time Marco speaks on that tape, he digs his grave 6 feet deeper. By the time the Sterling family gets up those stairs, there won't be enough of Marco left to bury." They reached the service elevator. Lorenzo swiped the keycard Sarah had stolen. The doors slid open with a soft chime that felt absurdly cheerful, given the circumstances. They stepped inside, and as the doors closed, sealing them in a steel box of silence, the adrenaline finally began to crash. Sarah slumped against the mirrored wall, letting out a breath that shuddered in her chest. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what she had just done. She had walked into the lion's den, stood before the man who murdered her family, and destroyed him without firing a fatal shot. Lorenzo watched her. He saw the crack in her armor. He stepped closer, invading her space, his presence a warm, solid anchor in the spinning world. "You did good, Sarah," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel crunching under tires. "Better than good. You executed a ghost." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glassy. "I wanted to kill him, Lorenzo. When I had the gun to his head, I wanted to paint that wall with his brains. I wanted him to stop breathing. But you didn't," Lorenzo said gently. He reached out, tucking a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her jawline. "You did something harder. You let him live to face the consequences. You chose justice over slaughter. That's the difference between a monster and a soldier." "I don't feel like a soldier," she whispered. "I feel empty." "It's the quiet," Lorenzo said. "You've been running on hate for 5 years. It's a powerful fuel. But now the tank is empty. Now you have to find something else to run on." The elevator dinged. Ground floor, kitchen service exit. "Ready?" Lorenzo asked. Sarah straightened her spine. She smoothed the crimson silk of her dress, wiped the vulnerability from her face, and nodded. "Ready." They exited through the kitchen. The staff was in a frenzy, shouting orders, completely unaware that the management upstairs was currently being dismantled. Lorenzo and Sarah moved like phantoms through the steam and clatter, slipping out the back delivery door into the biting cold of the Chicago night. The alleyway was dark, smelling of wet asphalt and snow. The winter wind hit them like a physical blow, instantly freezing the sweat on their skin. It was grounding. It was real. They walked to the side street where the limousines were idling. Most of the drivers were huddled together, smoking and checking their phones, oblivious to the war starting inside. But one car was waiting with the engine running. Sal. The young driver was standing by the rear door of the armored Mercedes, his breath puffing in white clouds in the frigid air. When he saw Lorenzo emerge from the shadows, battered but unbowed, wearing a tuxedo that cost more than Sal's house, his eyes went wide. "Boss?" Sal stammered, tossing his cigarette into a snowbank. I heard rumors. People say a lot of things, Sal." Lorenzo cut him off, his voice projecting authority he no longer officially held. "Open the door." Sal hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but Lorenzo saw it. The kid was doing the math. If the rumors were true, Lorenzo was a dead man walking. Helping him could be a death sentence. Lorenzo stopped. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at Sal. He looked at him with the weight of 20 years of command. You have a choice, kid. You can walk away right now. No one will blame you. Or you can drive. If you drive, there is no coming back, but you'll be paid enough to never drive again. Sal looked at Lorenzo, then at Sarah, who stood beside him like a blood-soaked angel. He looked at the hotel entrance, where security guards were starting to run around in panic. Sal opened the door. "Where to, boss?" "Just drive," Lorenzo said. "Head toward the lake, north." They slid into the leather interior. The door thudded shut, sealing out the cold and the noise. The car pulled away from the curb just as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the snow, painting the city in colors of emergency. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They watched the city pass by, the skyscrapers of the Loop, the flashing billboards, the dark expanse of the park. It was a city Lorenzo had ruled from the shadows for 2 decades. Every corner held a memory of a deal made, a rival buried, a bribe paid. And now it was all fading in the rearview mirror. "We can't go back to the cabin," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her practical mind was spinning up again. "Marco's men, the ones who stay loyal, will check there eventually, and the feds will be all over your known properties by morning." "We aren't going to the cabin," Lorenzo said. He pressed a button, raising the privacy partition between them and Sal. He wanted this conversation to be just for them. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out 2 items, a burner phone and a heavy silver key. "I have a contingency plan," Lorenzo admitted. "My father taught me that you always keep 1 bag packed that nobody knows about. Not your wife, not your underboss, not your lawyer." "Where?" Sarah asked. "Private airfield in Waukegan," Lorenzo said. "There's a Gulf Stream, fueled and waiting. The pilot is on a retainer. He doesn't ask questions, he just flies." "Flies where?" Lorenzo turned to look at her. The passing streetlights illuminated his face in rhythmic flashes. He looked younger, somehow. The weight of the crown was gone. "Wherever we want," he said. "But the flight plan is filed for Italy. Tuscany. There's a vineyard near Siena. It's owned by a shell corporation that leads to a trust in the Cayman Islands, that leads to a dead man in Switzerland. It's a ghost house. It doesn't exist on any paper that matters." Sarah stared at him. "You were planning to leave? Even before this?" "I was tired, Sarah." Lorenzo sighed, leaning his head back against the seat. "I was tired of the blood, tired of looking over my shoulder. I wanted out. But in this life, you don't retire. You die. Or you wait for someone like Marco to come along and push you out." He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "Tonight, Marco didn't just betray me. He set me free. He thinks he took my empire. He can have it. He can have the feds, the wars, the paranoia. I'm done." Sarah processed this. She looked out the window at the dark water of Lake Michigan churning against the shore. "So that's it? We just disappear?" "I disappear," Lorenzo corrected her. You have a choice." He held up the burner phone. "This phone has 1 number programmed into it. A clean contact at the FBI. If you call them, tell them where Marco is. Tell them you have the original ledgers. They'll put you in witness protection. You'll get a new life, a safe life. You can go back to being Sarah Miller. You can meet a nice guy, have kids, live in the suburbs." He held out the phone to her. It sat in his open palm, a small black object that represented a normal life. "Or?" Sarah asked, not taking the phone. Lorenzo held up the silver key. "Or you come with me, to Italy. to a life that isn't safe, but it's free. A life where we don't have to hide who we are. But if you come with me, Sarah, there is no going back. You're Sarah Miller no more. You're someone else entirely. The car hummed over the asphalt. The heater blasted warm air. It was the most important moment of their lives. Sarah looked at the phone. It was tempting. Safety. Normalcy. The picket fence she had dreamed of before Marco burned her world down. Then she looked at Lorenzo. She looked at the man who had stitched her wounds, who had trusted her with his life, who had treated her as an equal when the rest of the world saw her as a servant. She thought about the heat of his hand in hers. She thought about the thrill of the plan, the dance of danger they had performed so perfectly together. She realized with a jolt that she couldn't go back to being normal. She had tasted the fire, and she didn't want to go back to the cold. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out. She took the burner phone from his hand. Lorenzo's face fell. Just a fraction. He started to nod, accepting her choice. I understand. I'll have Sal drop you at a secure... Sarah rolled down the window. The roar of the wind filled the cabin. Without a word, she tossed the phone out. It disappeared into the snowy darkness of the highway. She rolled the window back up and turned to Lorenzo. I don't speak Italian, she said, a small, mischievous smile playing on her lips. You're going to have to teach me. Lorenzo stared at her for a heartbeat, and then a grin broke across his face. A genuine, dazzling smile that transformed him. He laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. I think I can manage that, he said. He reached for her then, no longer holding back. He pulled her across the seat, his hands tangling in her hair, and kissed her. It wasn't the tentative, careful kiss of two people trying to survive. It was a hungry, passionate claim. It tasted of champagne and victory. It was the seal on a blood pact that went deeper than any mafia oath. They held each other as the car turned off the highway and toward the private airfield. The city of Chicago, with all its ghosts and graves, was behind them. One last thing, Sarah said, pulling back slightly, her forehead resting against his. If we're going to Italy, if we're starting over, I'm not polishing any more silver. And I am definitely not ironing your shirts, Lorenzo chuckled, kissing her forehead. Deal. We'll hire someone. But we'll do a better background check this time. An hour later, the Gulfstream jet roared down the runway, its engines screaming as it defied gravity. Inside, Lorenzo and Sarah sat across from each other, champagne flutes in hand. Below them, the city was a grid of golden lights. Somewhere down there, Marco Vane was likely being dragged out of the Grand Hotel by the Sterling family, his reign ending before it even began. Somewhere down there, the FBI was raiding the Moretti estate ruins. Somewhere down there, the legend of the Maid and the mobster was being born, a story that would be whispered in speakeasies and prison yards for decades to come. But high above the clouds, where the air was thin and the stars looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet, none of that mattered. Lorenzo raised his glass. To the past. May it stay dead. Sarah clinked her glass against his, her eyes sparkling. And to the future. May it be dangerous. Why dangerous? Lorenzo asked, amused. Because safe is boring, Sarah replied. And I think we're done with boring, Mr. Moretti. Please, he said, taking a sip of the golden liquid. Mr. Moretti died in an explosion 3 weeks ago. Call me Lorenzo. Lorenzo, she tested the name, liking the way it sounded without the title attached. And you can call me. She paused, looking out the window as the plane banked east, toward the Atlantic, toward the sunrise, toward a vineyard in Tuscany, where the grapes were sweet and the history was deep. "Call me the boss," she finished with a wink. Lorenzo laughed, the sound echoing in the cabin. "Yes, ma'am." The jet disappeared into the clouds, leaving no trace behind but the turbulence in its wake. The Mafia boss had come home early, and the maid had told him to stay silent. They had followed the silence all the way to the end, and found that on the other side it wasn't silence at all. It was music, and that is the story of how a Mafia boss and a maid brought down an empire to build something new. From enemies to partners, Lorenzo and Sarah proved that sometimes the person you suspect the least is the one who saves you the most. What did you think of Sarah's decision at the end? Should she have pulled the trigger, or was letting the other families handle Marco the ultimate revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this twist-filled mafia romance, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We have a thriller coming up next week about a billionaire who fakes his own death, and you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes silence is the loudest weapon you have. Stay safe, everyone.